Hi everyone, this is In Science. My name is Elena, and I'm happy to welcome you to our Science Kids Lecture, a popular science series for children and everyone who is just getting to know science. Today we'll be talking about what alien life might look like, and this lecture will be hosted for you by microbiologists Yevgenia Prekrasna and me, astrophysicist Olena Kompaniets. You can watch this webinar thanks to the support of the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Now is the perfect moment to send lots of hearts and reactions in the chat to thank this university for supporting our lecture series. And if you're watching us on YouTube, we'd be very happy if you shared your impressions in the comments under this video. So, let's get to know our lecturers. Yevgenia Prekrasna Kvyatkovska is a microbiologist, PhD in biological sciences, and a senior researcher at the National Antarctic Scientific Center of Ukraine. And yes, Yevgenia really has been to Antarctica. And I am Olena Kompaniets, an astrophysicist, a researcher at the main astronomical observatory of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine, and the education coordinator of the Science Kids Lecture Series. And now I have a question for you. What do you think? Do aliens exist? Write a plus in the chat if you think they do, and a minus if you think they don't. And if you're watching us on YouTube, share what you think in the comments too. I can already see lots and lots of pluses in the chat. So let's figure out what science thinks about this, whether aliens can exist, and if they do, what they might look like. We'll start by looking at how science fiction authors imagine aliens. Of course, we'll quote and show you different alien species and civilizations from one of the largest collections of alien life in fiction, the universe of Star Wars. You can also write in the chat if you've watched Star Wars before, but it's not just Star Wars. There are many aliens in science fiction. Another very famous story is about a very special alien friend. Put a plus sign in the chat if you know this alien and have seen cartoons or movies with them. Let's move on. Even though science fiction is full of different alien species and civilizations, in our previous lectures, we've already talked a bit about what kinds of planets aliens might live on. Today, we should remind ourselves that in our galaxy alone, there are about 100 billion stars. And that's just our galaxy. In the universe, there are trillions of galaxies, and almost every one of these stars may have planets. Despite this huge number of possible planets, as of 2025, we know of a bit more than 7,000 exoplanets, planets orbiting other stars. This number is constantly changing as astronomers make new discoveries. You can see the updated counts on NASA or European observatory websites, but if we compare that to the number of stars in our galaxy, there could easily be billions of exoplanets. So just imagine how much unknown and amazing stuff is out there, and how much may still be waiting to be discovered. So, let's imagine that aliens do exist. What could alien life look like, and what does its appearance depend on? We'll start with the idea that a lot depends on surface temperature and atmospheric composition. For example, let's compare Earth during the Ice Age and Earth today. Back then, mammoths lived here, and paleontologists say that in Ukrainian, it's actually most correct to call them mamuti. They were covered in thick fur, which helped them stay warm in cold climates. Today, we don't need that kind of fur, so we don't have it. So we can assume that if a planet is colder than Earth, its aliens might have lots of hair or fur. On the contrary, if a planet is warmer than Earth, or similar to Earth, they may have less hair or fur. The size of aliens might also depend on what their atmosphere is made of. For example, one possible reason why insects were much larger in the past is that Earth's atmosphere used to contain more oxygen than it does now. So, depending on the surface temperature and atmospheric composition of a planet, aliens could look very different from us. But that's not the only factor that determines what aliens might look like. The size and composition of a planet also determine its gravity. In this video, I've shown it a few times in other lectures, but I'll repeat it here because it's important. You can see how a person jumps with the same effort on different objects in the solar system, and how high they get each time. If on Earth that jump is about 45 centimeters, then on Mars, where gravity is weaker, it's a bit more than 1 meter. And as gravity decreases further, the same jump sends them higher and higher. On Phobos, one of Mars's moons, with the same jump, you could rise to a height of more than 700 meters. So yes, jumping in space should be done very carefully. Now, you might be wondering, why is she talking about gravity again? The point is that every time you get out of bed or up from a chair or even just move around, your muscles have to be strong enough to overcome gravity, to lift your body up, raise your arm, take a step. Based on that, we can guess that gravity will definitely influence what aliens look like. If gravity is weaker than on Earth, aliens will most likely be taller, but their muscles may be weaker and not very bulky. If gravity is stronger than on Earth, aliens will probably be shorter, closer to the ground, with very strong muscles to support their weight. Another important factor is which star the planet orbits. Our eyes evolved to adapt to the type of light emitted by our star, the Sun. The Sun is a yellow dwarf star, but in the universe and in our galaxy, there are also red stars and blue stars. Blue stars are hotter and emit a lot of light in the ultraviolet range. We can't see ultraviolet with our eyes, but it's what gives us a suntan. An ordinary glass doesn't let ultraviolet pass through. So, if aliens evolved on a planet orbiting a blue star and their eyes adapted to see mostly ultraviolet light, then when they came to Earth, they wouldn't be able to see through glass. For them, it would look like a completely black, opaque wall. On the other hand, if aliens evolved near a cooler star than the Sun, for example, a red star, its radiation peaks in the infrared range. We also can't see infrared light, but we ourselves glow in infrared, and that's why night vision devices work. So if such aliens came to Earth, they would probably see people as glowing figures, not the way we're used to seeing each other. No matter what we imagine about what aliens look like or where they might live, for now, the only planet where we know life exists is Earth. So when we search for planets that could host alien life, our main strategy is to look for planets as similar to Earth as possible. Earth is still the only planet where we know life definitely exists. The search for life on other planets and the study of life in extreme conditions to understand where life might exist elsewhere is a job of astrobiology, a science at the intersection of astronomy and biology. So, on Earth, we can study different extreme environments that seem completely unsuitable for life, and then look for similar extreme environments in space to guess what might live there. And now I'll hand over to my colleague Yevgenia, a microbiologist, who will tell you about these extreme environments and what life can look like there. Yevgenia, over to you. Thank you, Elena, for bringing us back to planet Earth. Things here are actually very interesting, no less interesting than in space. At first glance, our planet looks quite mild and comfortable. We have plenty of liquid water, oxygen in the atmosphere, and relatively moderate temperatures. But in reality, Earth has many spots where conditions are very harsh. For example, permafrost, hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the oceans, very acidic lakes, extremely salty bodies of water, and so on. And to scientists' great surprise, life thrives in all these places. When scientists started finding life in such environments, our idea of the limits of life expanded dramatically. It also allowed us to look differently at the possibility of life in space. Because if life on Earth can exist in such harsh conditions here, it can also exist under similar conditions on another planet or moon. The organisms that live in these extreme and unusual conditions are called extremophiles. We call them extremophiles only from our human point of view, because for these microorganisms, the environment is completely normal and comfortable. There's another important idea here. We should look at Earth itself a bit differently. The planet hasn't always looked the way it does now. Scientists think that life appeared on Earth almost as soon as the planet itself formed. The microfossils shown in these photos, the little black spots on a red mineral, are about 3.8 billion years old, while Earth formed about 4.5 billion years ago. The conditions back when life started were nothing like today. They would be absolutely unsuitable for us. Higher temperatures, no oxygen in the atmosphere, very active volcanism. And yet, those conditions were perfectly fine for extremophile microorganisms. So we can say that extremophilic microorganisms were the first living beings to appear on our planet. That's why if somewhere in space there is a planet similar to young Earth, it's quite possible that microbial life is already thriving there. Let's talk more specifically about these extremophiles, the different kinds that exist. There are many of them, and huge diversity, and many species are still not described at all. In this lecture, I'll focus on those extremophiles that might be relevant to potential conditions in space. We'll start with hyperthermophiles, microorganisms that like to live where it's hot or even very hot. Hyperthermophiles live and grow at temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius. That's the temperature at which proteins in most organisms start to break down, but not in hyperthermophiles. Many of them prefer temperatures above 80 degrees Celsius or even close to 100 degrees Celsius. On the slide, you see a black and white image of one record holder among hyperthermophiles, Geogemma barrosii. It can reproduce at 121 degrees Celsius. Why is that interesting? Because in labs, scientists sterilize their flasks, tubes, and tools at about the same temperature, hoping to kill all bacteria there. And usually they do. But Geogemma barrosii feels great and keeps reproducing even at that temperature. At the opposite end of the spectrum are psychrophiles and lovers of the cold. That's literally what their name means. They live where it's very cold, in the Arctic, in Antarctica, and at the bottom of oceans where it's also quite cold. A bright example of a psychrophile is this round bacterium in the upper corner of the slide, Planococcus halocriophyllus. It reproduces at minus 15 degrees Celsius and stays alive even at minus 25 degrees Celsius. We know that freezing usually kills cells because ice crystals form inside them and tear them apart. But that's not the case for this psychrophile. Planococcus halocriophyllus. Besides loving low temperatures, Planococcus halocriophyllus also loves very salty environments. We know that pure water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius, and to remain liquid at minus 25 degrees Celsius, it has to contain a lot of dissolved salt. Microorganisms that like salty conditions are called halophiles. You may have seen pink salty lakes, for example, in southern Ukraine on the Kinburn Spit. If you have, put a plus in the chat. They're pink for a reason. There are halophiles living in them. Their cell membranes contain special proteins called bacteriorhodopsins, which convert sunlight into chemical energy, somewhat similar to how photosynthesis works in plants. These proteins are pinkish, so they give salty lakes their pink color. A typical halophile is Halomonas. You can see a black and white image. And I also wanted to show you Haloquadratum walsby because it has a very unusual shape. We're used to bacteria being round or rod-shaped, but Haloquadratum is square. That's one of its unusual adaptations to its environment. Very salty environments include not only surface lakes like the one in the photo, but also brines under glaciers or submarine brine pools at the bottom of the ocean. In such salty and not only salty underwater lakes, under glaciers or on the ocean floor, life is exposed to enormous pressure. On this diagram, you can see a vertical slice of the ocean, a beautiful column of water. Imagine it's about 1,000 meters deep, and on the bottom lies a tiny bacterium. For example, Schoenella piezotolerans. The entire mass of water above presses down on this tiny cell, but it doesn't care because it's a piezophile, adapted to high pressure. There are many such microorganisms. They live in the water column, on the seafloor, in sediments, in rocks, and even deeper in Earth's crust. At 1,000 meters depth, the pressure is still not the highest that such microorganisms can handle. Scientists have even found microbes in sediments 2,000 meters under the seafloor. Often, when we talk about extremophiles, we mean organisms that live where there's more than one extreme factor. For example, very cold and very salty, or very hot with high pressure, as in hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor. In such cases, we call them polyextremophiles, and there are many of those too. I also want to mention another important ability of some microorganisms, the ability to live without oxygen. Microorganisms that live without oxygen are called anaerobes. I'm not showing you any particular anaerobe on the slide, because for microbes, this isn't even a special superpower. It's actually very common. There are many places on Earth where there's no oxygen at all. For example, inside ordinary clumps of soil. To us, a small clod of soil looks like nothing special, but it contains many microzones with different conditions, including areas where oxygen doesn't reach. Bacteria are so tiny that they can easily live in those anoxic pockets. This is also important when we think about extraterrestrial life. So we've talked about many conditions that life, especially extremophiles, can tolerate. Now let's narrow it down. What are the key factors that limit life? The conditions that are necessary for, so far, Earth-like life? If you have ideas, you can write them in the chat. The first and most limiting factor is the presence of liquid water. Liquid water is the medium in which all processes in our bodies take place. It is absolutely essential. That's why astrobiologists are very, very interested in whether there is liquid water on other worlds. Second, nutrients. The elements living organisms are built from, the stuff we're made of. These are carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, and other elements, and we also need a source of energy. On Earth, most life ultimately depends on solar energy. One way or another, we all live off the sun. However, some microorganisms can use geothermal energy or energy from gravitational interactions. And now I'll hand the floor back to Elena, who will send us into space again, and we'll talk about where, in the solar system, there is or was liquid water. Thank you, Yevgenia. So now you know in how many strange and seemingly completely unearthly conditions, but still on Earth, microorganisms can live. Now let's talk about where in the solar system, besides Earth, there is liquid water. We actually already had a separate lecture about the search for life in the solar system. You can find it on YouTube and watch it in more detail. But within this lecture, I'll briefly go over it again because there have been some new updates. The first important news that flashed by this month is that scientists have found signs of past life on Mars. In the Jezero crater, which long ago was filled with water, and where the Perseverance rover is now working. Perseverance has found interesting traces in the rocks, chemical signatures, and certain minerals that may point to the presence of microorganisms in the past, because these substances are known to appear as a result of microbial activity. Here's what this discovery looks like. You can see a rock with patterns that look a bit like leopard spots. This is one of the possible traces of ancient life on Mars. Under the surface, there are liquid, salty lakes, and this isn't the only place in the solar system, besides Earth, where there is liquid water. For example, Jupiter's moon Europa. Europa's surface is completely covered in cracks of different depths. What's important is that beneath a thick layer of ice, there is an ocean, and very likely hydrothermal vents. So we expect that at the very least, microorganisms similar to those living in comparable extreme conditions on Earth could exist there. Saturn has a moon called Enceladus, whose surface is also covered by a thick ice shell. Its special feature is that from time to time, powerful geysers erupt from under the surface, one of the key pieces of evidence that liquid water exists there. So, much like on Europa, under Enceladus's thick ice crust, there may also be a liquid ocean. And now we return to the question, is there anything on Earth that is similar to these conditions, the ones on Europa, Enceladus, or even Mars? Before this, Yevgenia told you how life survives in various extreme environments on Earth. Now the question is whether we have something as close as possible to those Martian or icy moon conditions. Yevgenia, we're ready to move on. Yes, I'm back with you. Of course, scientists have found on Earth environments similar to those on Mars, Enceladus, and Europa, and they found them on the ice continent Antarctica. In this photo, you see the McMurdo Dry Valleys. They are considered the most Mars-like place on Earth. Scientists who have visited there say it sometimes feels more like Mars than Earth. The McMurdo Dry Valleys are the largest region in Antarctica that is not covered by ice or snow. It stays bare because strong winds blowing down from the mountains constantly sweep away snow and ice. It's one of the driest and coldest places on Earth, a cold, dry desert. At first glance, it looks like no life could survive there. But life has adapted. Microorganisms there live inside rocks, as you can see in the photo. They colonize tiny pores in the stone, which protects them from ultraviolet radiation, repeated freezing and thawing, and in those pores a little moisture can condense, enough for them to live on. Besides these Martian conditions, Antarctica also has a huge number of subglacial lakes, which are very similar to what we expect on Europa or Enceladus. There are about 500 of them, often covered by a very thick layer of ice or glacier. Again, very reminiscent of Europa and Enceladus. Let's look at one of these lakes. For example, Lake Vida. On the map you can see marked by a red dot where it is in Antarctica. It's a very salty and icy lake covered by an enormous ice layer about 21 meters thick. If we compare that to buildings, it's about the height of a 5-story building. This thick ice cover means that very little sunlight reaches the water below. The water is extremely salty, about 6 times saltier than seawater, and very cold at about minus 13 degrees Celsius. And yet, in these harsh conditions, there is life. Life thrives there, a diverse community of microorganisms. This gives us hope that we might also find similar life somewhere in space. If we now summarize our lecture a bit, we can say the following. If life exists on Mars or Europa, on those cosmic bodies scientists see as candidates for hosting life, it is most likely microscopic. These microorganisms would probably be extremophils, for example, halophiles, to survive in salty brines under the Martian surface, or piezophiles, able to withstand high pressure, or organisms that can tolerate very high or very low temperatures depending on conditions in the oceans of Enceladus and Europa. I want to add that even though in the solar system, apart from Earth, any life that might exist is most likely microbial, very small, we have no idea what we might find beyond the solar system. From our previous lectures, you already know that even among just a few thousand known exoplanets, there are planets similar to Earth, potential ocean planets, super-Earths with strong gravity, planets colder or hotter than Earth, so we really don't know how much incredible and astonishing life might be out there in space. For now, we can only use science as our foundation and then imagine what could be. And that's why we've prepared a list of science fiction books about aliens that we recommend you read. First is Aurora Rising by J. Kristoff and Amy Kaufman, the Aurora series, recommended for ages 12+. A human cadet, Tyler Jones, is one of the most promising and also most problematic students at the Academy. His crew members include representatives of different alien species, and the story explores their interactions and adventures together. We've also mentioned this series many times in our webinars. Warrior Cats, which has been coming out since 2016 and continues to this day. It plays with the classic science fiction question, what if the planet were inhabited not by humanoid beings, but by cats? Thinking about this, a group of authors writing under the pen name Aaron Hunter created a long series of adventure novels. At the center of the story is a clan of wildcats who get into incredible adventures, trying to protect their territory and way of life. We also recommend the animated film Elio. In it, a boy named Elio lives with his aunt, a major in the Air Force, on a military base, and dreams that one day he'll be taken away by aliens. And that's exactly what happens. A spaceship suddenly makes contact with Earth and takes Elio aboard. The aliens mistake him for the leader of Earth and give him an important mission to save the galaxy from a warlord in exile, Lord Grigon. And what happens next? You can find out by watching the film. And of course, we couldn't skip a true classic that I watched as a child, and that your parents might have watched too, your E.T., The Extraterrestrial by Steven Spielberg, 1982. It's a classic of family science fiction, the story of friendship between a lonely boy named Elliot and a kind alien who accidentally gets left behind on Earth when his spaceship has to take off quickly to escape a military raid. The alien looks a bit like a turtle without a shell, and his face is something between a pug and Albert Einstein. The film shows how this very unusual friendship between a human boy and an alien forms and grows. And this is where our lecture part basically ends. I can see we've gone a little over time, but there was really so much we wanted to share with you. So now we move on to your optional homework, or rather, I should say, not quite homework, but a creative task you can do if you like. In this season, after each webinar, we suggest a new task in this format. You can print this card out, copy it by hand, or completely ignore our design and create your own. Whatever you like best. This time, here's the question for your character. What does the alien your character meets look like? What do they have in common? And what is the most interesting thing your character tells the alien about planet Earth? We'll really be looking forward to your tasks, which you can send to our Telegram chat. If you're not with us there yet, you can scan this QR code to join. And with that, our lecture comes to an end. I want to tell you that I, Olena Kompaniets, will also be hosting the next lecture for you. We'll talk about what kind of spaceship we'd need to travel to other planets. Thank you for staying with us, and see you next time. Bye-bye.